whenever we talk to people, and you're not the first person to say this, I keep thinking the same thing, which is, do we really have a democracy in that case? Because we elect leaders to enact certain policies. If those policies can't be enacted because the powers that be, the forces, quote unquote, refuse to let them be enacted, I mean, do we have a democracy? Really?
Well, it's not democratic enough. There's no doubt about that, in my view.
But that's a very, very serious problem because...
It is a serious problem. Because it's an absolutely serious problem. And the other side of this argument will talk about things like institutions. They'll talk about tram lines that politicians should be operating in. But what they fundamentally mean is that politicians need checks and balances against enacting things that are democratically decided. And what we've seen, and not just in Britain, right across the free world, is we've seen a growth in the power of unelected bodies. There's no doubt in my mind. And it's not just the Office of Budget Responsibility or the Bank of England. It's also the Environment Agency. It's the Climate Change Committee. It's people who are not democratically accountable are effectively making decisions. And I think that's a problem. I don't think it's democratic.
It's a massive problem. And I think as an ordinary person looking at this, which I am, I'm going, I didn't vote for the civil service. I didn't vote for the OBR. I didn't vote for the Bank of England. I didn't vote for the Environmental Agency. So at the same time, I'm also thinking, well, the Conservative government has been in power for 14 years. Surely they would have been aware of all of this. Why haven't they done anything?
I don't think, well, so I first got elected in 2010. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when you get elected as an MP, you assume a lot of things about the level of power and influence you're going to have. And those are not always true. Yeah. And, I became a minister in 2012. I was a junior minister. I found it frustrating that it was difficult to get things done, but I assumed it was because I was junior in the organisation, that if I was a Secretary of State, it would be easier to get things done. And as a Secretary of State, I was able to do some things, but it was still the case. It was hard going. It was hard going implementing Conservative policies when that was not the broad view of the system.
Can you give an example? Sorry to interrupt, Liz. Could you give an example where you had a policy that you wanted to be enacted and then for whatever reason it was scuppered or diluted down to the point where it was simply unrecognisable?
So the first job I had was in the education department, and I wanted to deregulate childcare to make it cheaper. We've got some of the most cumbersome childcare rules in the world, and we've got some of the most expensive childcare. So I wanted to change that. And what you find is that no one ever says, no, we're not going to implement the policy. What they do is they take a long time about it. It's sometimes called consent and evade. So it'll just be, yes, Minister, we'll go and look at that. We need to do a bit more work on this, blah, blah, blah. So what you'll find is it takes a long time to do things. And often the civil servants in the department will be in touch with the so-called sector, which is generally the vested interest within whichever area you're talking about, whether it's environmental NGOs or the nursery sector or whatever. And you find yourself ending up having to compromise to get things done quicker. This is also true of things like appointments as well, but you'll have to compromise to get things done quicker. You'll find there's a lot of opposition from the sector or the organisation you're dealing with. So in the case of the childcare reforms I wanted to do, before I even got them out, I'd had to make quite a lot of compromises, so they weren't as good as what I would have wanted to do and what I think is right, making them more like the system in France, for example, which is actually better than the system in Britain. So it's hard to describe the process, but it's all very long-winded, driven by endless layers of people having to look at things. So it just takes a long time. And then by the time I'd finally got the policy out, Nick Clegg had been so lobbied by the childcare sector and by Mumsnet that he blocked the policy. And therefore, a policy which would have made lives better for families across Britain, would have given them more flexibility, didn't happen. So that's the kind of thing that happens on each policy you were looking at. Or a lot of the things we're talking about, take the Environment Agency, for example. In order to override the decisions that organisation makes or to change the way the organisation works, you need primary legislation. So that will take you 2 years to get a bill through. You've got to get the bill approved in advance before you even get to the stage of primary legislation. So unless you are absolutely focused on one thing and absolutely determined to drive it through and prepared to spend a lot of time, it is very difficult to make things happen. And unfortunately, a system has been created where you're operating in that sort of constant sort of confinement, if that makes sense. I mean, so...
Sounds like a straitjacket to me.
Well, basically, yes. And so as Environment Secretary, I was in, the department was in court constantly. So we were in court with the Badger Truss, we were in court with the climate change, the sort of clean air campaign. There's all sorts of environmental bodies would be suing us all the time. So it's not just that there are civil servants with a particular worldview, and by the way, there are. It's also that they are understandably very frightened of being sued. And the sort of powers of judicial review allow that to happen. So you've got a system that's constantly looking, covering its back, looking at what bad things might happen, therefore making it very, very difficult to push a positive policy forward.
So reading between the lines then, and coming back to your own story, you're a junior minister, you struggle to get too much done even though you try. You think, well, I better become a senior minister. You struggle to get as much done as you'd like, so you're like, I better become prime minister. And then you get into 10 Downing Street, and I'm guessing it's probably the biggest straitjacket of all. Is that fair?
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you discover, because, I sat there in governments under David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, thinking, why doesn't the Prime Minister do this? Why can't we short circuit this? Why can't we get on with this? And what I discovered in the job as Prime Minister is how constraining the overall, it's not the case that when you get to the top, there's more freedom of maneuver. Actually, there isn't. And what I tried to do, essentially with the growth plan, which I developed with Kwasi Kwarteng, was to take on that economic orthodoxy, which I think has been behind why Britain has had low growth and stagnation for almost 2 decades. I tried to take that on, but I found that even at that level, trying to take on these unelected institutions is extremely difficult. And I didn't realise how ruthlessly those people would fight back.
Just a very quick question.
I thought that, going through the system, well, maybe there are political decision makers above me who are, pulling the strings, making sure that these things don't happen. Maybe there is but when I got to the top job, I found that wasn't the case.